Hello and welcome. You are dialed into Renegade Files, your secret spot for paranormal events, unexplained mysteries, and indie cultural analysis. I'm your host, Lex Gordon, broadcasting from the Jungle Villa Outpost, deep in the uncharted tropics. This is Renegade Files episode 104, the Roswell UFO Incident, Part 2. The Roswell story didn't end with a flying saucer headline. In many ways, that was just the beginning. Here, in Part 2 of our Roswell UFO Incident Deep Dive, we follow what happened after the world was told that a crashed flying saucer had been recovered in New Mexico. Within hours, the story reversed. The debris was reclassified, the witnesses were minimized, and a new explanation took hold. What followed wasn't clarification but containment. This episode examines the Fort Worth press conference and how ridicule, repetition, and media compliance transformed Roswell from an open mystery into a closed case. From there, we trace how the Roswell official narrative playbook echoes into the modern era, culminating in the famous but lackluster Pentagon UFO report, which conspicuously omitted Roswell entirely and fell back on familiar explanations that have been used for decades. Together, Parts 1 and 2 form a complete investigation into how Roswell shaped not just UFO mythology, but official response itself. If you haven't already, be sure to go back and listen to the previous episode, Renegade Files episode 103, the Roswell UFO Incident Part 1, before listening to this episode to experience the full arc of this story. Now, in Part 2, we pick right back up where we left off last time and start with File 6, the official reversal. Real fast, and before we start, I want to mention that right now we are conducting a follower drive. It's simple, totally free for you to help, and takes literal seconds. My goal is to build our followers on Spotify, Apple, and wherever you're listening. This helps people find Renegade Files because more followers means that the platforms show us to more listeners. On Spotify, tap Renegade Files under the episode title and then hit follow. On Apple Podcasts, open an episode, tap the three dots at the top right, hit Go to Show, hit those three dots again, and then tap follow. Anywhere else, just hit follow on the show's page, or maybe subscribe in places like YouTube. If you could please do this as a favor for me and help Renegade Files hit our goal of 100,000 followers. If you're already a follower, you can still help by sending your friends to therenegadefiles.com and suggesting that they follow us on their favorite platform, because following Renegade Files is easy, it's free, and it keeps you connected to new episodes. Thank you so much. Now, let's dive in. File 6, the official reversal. Truth doesn't vanish. It's overwritten. In the morning of July 9, 1947, less than 24 hours after the RAAF announced that it had recovered a flying saucer, the story abruptly changed. What had been presented to the public with clarity and confidence was now treated as a mistake, an overstatement, and a misunderstanding. The extraordinary claim that had captured national attention was quietly withdrawn and replaced with something far more ordinary. The speed of this reversal is one of the most important details in the Roswell case. It wasn't the result of new evidence discovered over weeks or months. It was not the product of careful analysis or gradual clarification. It happened almost immediately, as though a switch had been thrown somewhere far away from the desert of Roswell. The original announcement didn't come from a rumor, or an anonymous leak, or an overeager journalist. It came directly from the Public Information Office of the Roswell Army Airfield, issued under the authority of General William H. Blanchard, commander of the 509th Bomb Group. At the time, the 509th was the most sensitive military unit in the world, responsible for nations' nuclear strikes. Its public statements were never made casually nor lightly. But on July 9th, that same institution was telling the press that the debris covered near Roswell was nothing more than a weather balloon, possibly associated with a radar target. There was no flying disc. There was no advanced material. There was no mystery that required further investigation. According to the revised explanation, the entire affair had been a simple case of misidentification. This immediate reversal raised questions even among journalists who were accustomed to trusting the military. Weather balloons were not obscure technology in 1947. They were launched regularly, and many civilians in the Southwest had encountered their remnants before. Ranchers in particular were familiar with the debris left behind when balloons came down across grazing fields. Trained recovery military personnel certainly knew the difference. If the material found on the Foster Ranch had clearly belonged to a weather balloon, the situation would have ended there. There would have been no involvement from the base commander, no intelligence officer dispatched to the field, and no press release announcing the recovery of anything. The story would have resolved itself quietly, as countless others had before. Instead, the military initially treated the debris as something extraordinary. Only after higher levels of command became involved did the explanations change. The reversal didn't originate in Roswell itself. Evidence suggests it came from further up the chain of command after the implications of the original announcement became clear. A claim that the Army had recovered a UFO was destabilizing in ways that were difficult to control. It invited questions that could not be easily answered, and it threatened to open doors that military leadership was not prepared to walk through. The revised statements were not made to clarify the truth, but to replace it. To solidify the new narrative, the military arranged a press event at Fort Worth Army Airfield in Texas. This location wasn't chosen at random. Fort Worth was a major command center, far removed from the ranch where the debris had been found and far from the civilians who had first handled the material. It was a controlled environment where the visual story could be managed. At Fort Worth, photographs were taken of Major Jesse Marcel, the same intelligence officer who had recovered the debris in New Mexico. In these images, Marcel is seen kneeling beside scraps of material laid out neatly on the floor. The debris consisted of crumpled foil, wooden sticks, rubber bands, and paper. These photographs were quickly distributed to newspapers across the country, accompanied by captions identifying the wreckage as a weather balloon. For the public, the images were persuasive. The material looked mundane, even trivial. The extraordinary claim from the day before was replaced by a visual narrative that suggested there had never been anything unusual to begin with. For those who had seen the original debris, the photographs were deeply disturbing. Witnesses who had handled the material recovered from the Foster Ranch described something entirely different. They spoke of extremely lightweight metal fragments that could not be permanently bent or creased, of beams with unfamiliar markings, and of materials that didn't behave like anything they had encountered before. None of these properties were visible in the Fort Worth photographs of ordinary wooden dowels and thin, wrinkled foil. Mac Brazel, the farmer who had first discovered the material, was present during this phase of the story, and his behavior changed noticeably. Initially, Mac Brazel had spoken openly about the strange nature of the material. He told reporters that it didn't resemble parts of an aircraft or a balloon, and he seemed genuinely puzzled by what he had found. After spending time in military custody and being interviewed by officials, Brazel's public statements shifted. He began to downplay the debris, describing it as ordinary and unremarkable. He expressed regret for having brought it to the attention of the authorities at all. Those who knew him later recalled that he appeared nervous and guarded when discussing the incident. Journalists also noticed the change. Friends noticed it as well. Brazel reportedly remained under military supervision for several days, an unusual situation for a rancher whose only action had been reporting debris found on his land. The pressure was subtle, but effective. And Mac Brazel, a small farmer who had a long history of barely being able to survive on what he made, suddenly bought a new truck, moved far away, bought land, and opened a restaurant, never to be really heard from again publicly. People speculated that he had somehow or for some reason been paid off by the government. Other witnesses also reacted strongly to the balloon explanation. Loretta Parker, who had examined fragments that Brazel brought to her home, stated unequivocally that the material shown in the Fort Worth photographs was not what she had seen. Frank Joyce, the radio station manager who had spoken with Brazel early on, expressed skepticism about this revised story, and he later recalled being warned not to pursue the subject matter. Most striking of all was the testimony of Major Jesse Marcel himself. In later interviews, Marcel stated clearly and consistently that the material displayed at the Fort Worth press conference was not the same material he recovered in New Mexico. He explained that when he arrived in Texas, he was instructed to pose with debris that he did not recognize as the original wreckage. He complied with the order, but he never felt truly accepting of the balloon explanation as accurate. This was the moment when the substitution occurred. The public was shown one set of debris while being told it represented another. The original material vanished into classification, probably into that big warehouse we see at the end of the first Indiana Jones movie, while the replacement material entered the historical record. Over time, repetition smoothed over the distinction between the two until the official story hardened into an accepted fact. The press conference achieved its immediate goal. Newspapers printed the balloon explanation and the photographs. The dramatic story of a captured flying saucer faded quickly from the headlines, replaced by other news. For most Americans, the case was closed. But closure achieved through narrative control is not the same as a resolution. Behind the scenes, the reversal marked the beginning of a broader pattern. The Roswell incident had been actively reframed. Witnesses were discouraged from speaking, sometimes through direct warnings and sometimes through ridicule. Remember that chilling recording of Frankie telling us in part 1 that an MIB had visited her as a child and said that if she kept talking about what she had seen, her bones would be lost in the desert? The entire event was recorded as an embarrassing mistake rather than an unresolved mystery. It was only a weather balloon. If it was only a weather balloon, then why did a convoy of military trucks descend on Roswell in the days after the first debris was found and haul away large items under tarps and threaten the townsfolk to stay quiet? But in the end, it didn't matter what happened. It only mattered what the officials said had happened. This approach would become familiar in the decades that followed. Label the event as solved, attach a simple explanation, repeat that explanation consistently, and frame anyone's questions as unnecessary or irrational. Over time, the explanation becomes less about evidence and more about the simple explanation. The balloon explanation itself would evolve years later into the Project Mogul narrative, tying the debris to a classified program involving high-altitude balloons designed to detect Soviet nuclear tests. This got stirred into the mix of what was called Project High Jump, where crash dummies were dropped to study what happens when a parachute doesn't open. Many people use both of these to explain away the Roswell crash. You can find countless blog posts and articles saying they figured out what it was. It was Project High Jump, where crash dummies were dropped, and that's the story. Or it was Project Mogul, these crazy balloons they were using to study the Soviets. Those explanations are littering the internet. So, the crash dummies from Project High Jump were used to explain away the accounts of the alien bodies. And the debris from Project Mogul was used to explain away the weird-looking materials. I guess the military in Project High Jump was dropping crash dummies to see what would happen when a parachute doesn't open. That's our tax dollars at work right there. But the Project Mogul and Project High Jump explanations, they didn't emerge until decades after the fact, and they were never mentioned at the Fort Worth press conference. As evidence, both Project Mogul and Project High Jump fail to explain away the Roswell UFO crash on 3 levels. 1. Both fail to account for the strange properties of debris described by multiple witnesses. 2. Both ideas fall far short of explaining why it took a fleet of large trucks and military troops to recover and haul away wooden dowels and mylar. And 3. Neither project can explain why a nuclear strike base and its commanding officers and vehicle crash recovery experts would announce the recovery of an alien spacecraft in response to balloon debris on a sheep farm. These inconsistencies were never addressed directly. They were simply left to fade beneath the weight of repetition and time. What Roswell demonstrated, perhaps for the first time on a national scale, was that official history could be rewritten quickly and decisively. Statements could be issued and withdrawn without accountability. Once an explanation was offered, no matter how incomplete, it would be defended by institutional inertia. The witnesses didn't forget what they saw. Many spoke privately to their families. Some shared their stories years later, when the climate felt safer and when the weight of carrying a lie for decades was finally too heavy. Their accounts didn't change, and what they described conflicted dramatically with the official narrative. This mismatch is the true legacy of the Roswell reversal. The Roswell incident didn't fade because it was solved. It faded because it was managed. The reversal accomplished its immediate purpose, but it also left behind a fracture between lived experience and recorded history. As the years passed, that fracture widened. Similar patterns appeared in later cases, later reports, and later denials. The structure established at Roswell became a template, one that allowed unanswered questions to be set aside without ever being resolved. What began as a sudden reversal on July 1947 became a long-term strategy. Explanations were recycled, and the questions that remained were pushed just far enough out of view. The recovered UFO that had briefly entered the public record was erased. In its place, a balloon drifted quietly into history, carrying with it the first layer of a denial system that has continued to operate largely unchanged ever since. If you like these investigations and want to help keep this independent show alive, join the Renegade Files agency on Patreon for less than you tip a pizza delivery guy. Your support there directly funds the creation of episodes like this one, and it helps keep the show going. Such a small amount might seem like nothing, but it combines with small amounts from multiple people and crowdfunds this very show. Every new agent there gets bonus episodes that aren't available anywhere else. They get the dark intel files for each episode and secret dispatches from me. All of this only available to the RFA agents on Patreon. But more than that, you become part of a small group of listeners who make this work possible. If you believe in digging deeper, questioning the shadows, and keeping curiosity alive, then join me at patreon.com/renegadefiles. There's a link in the show notes. And become an RFA agent today. And thank you to the agents there already. You make this show possible. File 7, the Fort Worth Exhibition. Control the image, and you control the story. When the debris recovered near Roswell was transported out of New Mexico, it didn't travel quietly. It moved under military authority, accompanied by officers who understood that whatever had been found carried implications far beyond a rancher's fence in the desert. The destination was Fort Worth Army Airfield in Texas, a major command center and a place where information could be shaped before it reached the public. By the time the material arrived in Fort Worth, the narrative surrounding Roswell had already begun to shift. The initial RAAF headline had attracted intense attention, and with that attention came questions that could not be easily contained. Senior officers now understood that the story required visual reinforcement. Words alone would not be enough to undo the impact of the flying saucer headline. Images were required because a picture is worth 1,000 words. Fort Worth provided the ideal setting for this next phase. It was far removed from the debris field, far from the ranchers and civilians who had first encountered the material, and firmly under centralized control. Reporters could be invited, photographs could be staged, and the scene could be managed with precision. The press conference that followed was carefully constructed. The debris was laid out neatly on the floor of an office, arranged in a way that suggested order and familiarity. Major Jesse Marcel, the very intelligence officer who had been involved in the initial recovery, was instructed to pose with this material. Photographers were allowed to capture the moment, and the resulting images were distributed widely to newspapers across the country. The photographs showed scraps of foil, wooden sticks, flimsy material, unremarkable, easily identified. Accompanying captions explained that the debris was from a weather balloon. The visual message was unmistakable. The mystery, viewers were told, had been solved. Standing alongside this display was Brigadier General Roger Ramey, commander of the 8th Air Force. Ramey served as the authoritative voice of the explanation, assuring reporters that the debris had been misidentified initially and that there was no cause for further concern. His demeanor was calm and confident, projecting the impression of a situation fully understood and under control. To reinforce the explanation, Ramey consulted with an expert on crash debris identification. This expert examined the material presented and confirmed that it was indeed a weather balloon. The conclusion was delivered with technical certainty, providing journalists with a clear and official answer to print. For the press, the combination of images and expert testimony was decisive. Newspapers printed the photographs, ran the revised explanation, and closed the case forever. The flying saucer headline was replaced by a quieter correction, and within days, Roswell had faded from national attention. For the public, the exhibition did exactly what it was designed to do. It reframed the incident visually and psychologically. Readers could now see the debris for themselves, or at least they thought they could. The materials looked ordinary, the explanation felt reasonable, and curiosity was satisfied. But for those who had seen the original debris, the Fort Worth exhibition was deeply troubling. Mac Brazel had described the material as scattered across his ranch in a way that was unfamiliar to him. He spoke of fragments that were extremely light yet remarkably strong, of thin metallic sheets that returned to their original shape after being crumpled, with no signs of wrinkling, and beams that were marked with symbols he didn't recognize. Symbols that looked hieroglyphic. These descriptions were echoed by others who also handled the debris during the earliest stages of the recovery. The material shown in Fort Worth didn't match any of those descriptions. Loretta Proctor, who had examined pieces of the debris Brazel brought to her home, later stated that the items displayed in the photograph bore no resemblance to what she had seen. We've already gone over Frank Joyce saying the same thing, also Major Jesse Marcel. We've also gone over Major Jesse Marcel saying the same thing. So this Fort Worth exhibition marked a critical turning point. It was the moment when the physical evidence of the incident was redefined for the public. From that point on, the images of balloon debris became inseparable from the Roswell story. The distinction between what was found on the ranch and what was shown to the public eroded almost immediately. Newspapers repeated the balloon explanation so often that few people remembered the details of the original descriptions, especially back then. Over time, those photographs became the evidence. The eyewitness testimony was treated as secondary and unreliable. That shift had lasting consequences. Once a visual narrative was established, questioning it required effort. It required revisiting older accounts and comparing them carefully and acknowledging contradictions. For many, that work felt unnecessary. The case was settled, and settled cases rarely invite renewed scrutiny. Fort Worth also had a profound effect on the witnesses themselves. Those who had seen the original debris understood that the story presented to the public did not reflect their experience. Some spoke quietly among themselves, and others chose silence. Either way, the message was clear. The official version had been decided. Mac Brazel, after the Fort Worth press conference, gave public statements that were aligned closely with the new balloon explanation. He minimized his earlier remarks and expressed regret about even saying them. By presenting the debris as balloon material, the military effectively closed the door on any deeper inquiry into new stories. Reporters who might have followed up on a new UFO story decided not to. Editors moved on, and the window for investigating new UFO cases closed almost as quickly as it had opened. This approach was efficient and effective. It didn't rely on censorship or overt force. Instead, it relied on presentation, repetition, and authority. By shaping what people saw, the military had shaped what they believed. The implications of this strategy extended far beyond Roswell. It showed how easily an official display could redefine an event, replacing uncertainty with clarity. In the years that followed, researchers attempting to revisit the Roswell incident found themselves contending with this visual legacy. The balloon photographs were cited repeatedly as proof that the case had been solved. Witness accounts were dismissed as faulty memory or exaggeration, despite their consistency. The fact that the original materials had been identified as otherworldly by experts did very little to dissuade the official story. Over time, Fort Worth became a foundational moment in the history of UFO denial. It established a pattern that would be repeated in later incidents. Present a controlled image, provide an authoritative explanation, and allow repetition to do the rest. As memories faded and documents disappeared, the photographs endured. They were easy to reproduce, easy to reference, and easy to believe. Yet for many, the discomfort remained. Those who had seen the original debris never forgot its unusual properties. They never forgot how it felt in their hands or how it behaved when they manipulated it. No photograph of balloon wreckage would ever replace that experience. The Fort Worth press conference did not end the Roswell story, it just redirected it. It shifted attention away from unanswered questions and toward a narrative that required no further explanation. It allowed officials to move forward while leaving critical questions unanswered. In doing so, it set a precedent. Future incidents involving unidentified objects would follow a similar path. Initial confusion would give way to official clarification. Visual evidence would be curated. Expert opinions would be offered, and once the story appeared settled, curiosity was discouraged. Roswell was the first time this process unfolded on a national stage. By controlling what the public saw, the military controlled how the event was remembered. The debris on the floor in Texas replaced the debris in the desert of New Mexico, and that image eclipsed all other experience. From that moment on, the Roswell incident existed in two parallel forms. One lived in the memories who were there, the other lived in the photographs and the captions and the official statements of the debris that was presented. The tension between those two versions would become the engine that kept the story alive long after the exhibition itself had faded from the public view. What followed next wasn't silence but normalization. The explanation was accepted, the photographs were circulated, then the questions were set aside. File 8. Narrative Containment. Once a story is labeled explained, inquiry becomes suspicious. The recovered UFO story had been neutralized publicly, but it had not disappeared entirely. People still talked, witnesses still remembered, and journalists still knew that something unusual had happened. The revised explanation settled quickly into place. The debris had been misidentified, the initial announcement was a mistake, and the case was closed. This framing became the foundation upon which all subsequent cover-ups relied. Any attempt to reopen the matter was treated not as an investigation, but as ignorance regarding an established conclusion. Witnesses were the first to feel this shift. Those who had seen the original debris found their accounts quietly downgraded. The testimony was no longer evaluated on merit, but contextualized as confusion, faulty memory, or emotional reaction. The rancher became a symbol of rural misunderstanding. The simple country boy who had seen some newfangled modern contraption and thought it was from outer space. The radio station manager became a footnote. The intelligence officer's later statements were reclassified as personal opinion rather than professional assessment. Ridicule played an important role in this process. It didn't need to be overt, it could be subtle, delivered through tone rather than accusation. Witnesses were portrayed as sincere but mistaken, earnest but unsophisticated. Their experiences were framed as products of stress, excitement, or suggestion rather than direct observation. Once that framing took hold, their credibility eroded without their ever being formally challenged. At the same time, the balloon explanation solidified into something more durable than a theory. It became a default assumption. The longer it was repeated, the less it needed to be defended. Over time, it ceased to function as an explanation at all and simply became a reflex. This is how misidentification narratives gain power. They don't overwhelm opposing evidence, they just outlast it. Media behavior shifted accordingly. In the days immediately following Roswell, reporters had asked questions and sought witnesses, pursued details. But after the display in Fort Worth, that energy evaporated. Editors treated the matter as resolved. Follow-up stories were unnecessary, and it was already answered. That kind of thing. Journalists might have pursued inconsistencies, but not anymore. The answers were on record. The event had been explained. This is where the phrase asked and answered quietly entered the process. Once a story is labeled that way, further inquiry becomes suspect. It's no longer framed as journalistic diligence, but as fringe obsession. Those who continue asking questions are therefore seen as ill-informed agitators. This results in self-censorship, which is the most effective kind. Reporters move on, editors redirect resources, newsrooms stop returning calls, and the subject just fades, not because it lacks substance, but because it lacks institutional permission. This is also the period in American history where a new breed of UFO investigator emerges. These people, who may have previously taken up careers in academics or hard sciences, but refused to toe the party line when evidence outweighed policy statements. This is how we get researchers like J. Allen Hynek, Stanton Friedman, and Jacques Vallée. The self-censorship dynamic marked one of the earliest warning signs of what would later be recognized as institutional gaslighting. The witnesses weren't told they were lying. They were told that their experiences had already been explained. Don't you remember? If they disagreed, the problem wasn't with the explanation, but with their understanding. You just got it wrong, man. This message is subtle, but clear. Trust the official version and doubt your own memory. Over time, this approach reshaped public perception. Roswell became shorthand for embarrassment rather than inquiry. The incident was mentioned occasionally in pop culture, often with a wink or a laugh. Flying saucers were reduced to novelty items, punchlines, and science fiction tropes. This trivialization serves a purpose. By associating Roswell with humor or fantasy, serious discussion was discouraged without needing to be explicitly prohibited. As years passed, this framing hardened. Academic institutions avoided the topic. Mainstream scientists dismissed it outright. Government agencies treated it as settled history. The balloon explanation became a barrier that few people were willing to cross. Yet, beneath the surface, the witnesses remained. They told their families over and over what they had seen. They repeated their accounts privately, often with remarkable consistency. When researchers eventually tracked them down decades later, their stories still aligned in ways that defied easy dismissal. But by then, the narrative had been locked into place. The burden of proof shifted, and authorities were exempt from being required to explain discrepancies. Instead, the witnesses were required to justify their memories, and their personal testimony was treated as suspect by default. And in this way, the narrative was contained. The Roswell cover-up prototype demonstrated that controlling the interpretation of an event doesn't require much secrecy. It just requires repeated normalization. Once an explanation becomes familiar to people, challenging it feels unnecessary or even irresponsible. The very act of questioning something gets reframed as irrational. This pattern would repeat itself in later decades across multiple incidents, all involving unidentified objects. Initial confusion would be followed by rapid explanation. Often, these explanations don't even have to make logical sense. A favorite of debunkers is to say that a UFO witness saw this or that star. And they point out, using star charts and timestamps, that a particular star aligned with the object the person saw on that alleged night and time and location. This is extremely convenient because the night sky is a literal blanket of stars. and there will always be a bright one in any direction to overlap upon a UFO witness statement. It's the old, "It was a star. Here is the star chart, the time, the angle, the trajectory of star orbit, the earthly witness position, and their apparent viewpoint. That's the explanation." It all sounds very scientific, and yet it proves nothing. This is just one way that a UFO witness would be, and is still, reassured and then sidelined. Media attention spikes briefly and then vanishes. The story would settle into an official version that required no further engagement. What made Roswell unique was not that it followed this pattern, but that it established this pattern. The architecture of denial didn't emerge fully formed, it just kind of evolved. Roswell provided the early blueprint. The components were there. Identify the event, offer an explanation, repeat it. But once this structure was in place, it could be deployed again and again with minimal effort. By the time the modern era arrived, the groundwork had already been laid. When new reports surfaced involving military pilots or radar data, the response followed a familiar script. Officials acknowledged the sightings, then minimized them. The explanations varied, but the tone remained the same. Nothing to see here. The public, conditioned by decades of repetition, often accepted these statements without protest. After all, unexplained sightings had always turned out to be something ordinary, right? So this belief has been cultivated. This cultivation has discouraged serious research, stigmatized curiosity, and created an environment in which asking questions about aerial phenomena creates social risk. Even credible witnesses hesitate to come forward, aware of how easily their experiences could be reframed or dismissed. I've heard people in the aviation business say you would be hard-pressed to find any pilot in the world who does not believe in UFOs. By the late 20th century, the Roswell UFO incident existed primarily as a cultural artifact. It showed up in movies, TV shows, and jokes, and the original complexity of the event was lost beneath layers of repetition and parody. Yet the unanswered questions remained. What exactly was recovered near Roswell? Was the initial announcement true? How did trained military aircraft crash retrieval experts not recognize the materials of a weather balloon to such a degree that they wrote a press release saying it was from a UFO? Why did the material described by witnesses differ so dramatically from what was shown to the press? And why did the explanation change so quickly? These questions were never resolved. They were avoided. Narrative containment never eliminates uncertainty, but it just isolates it. It pushes unresolved issues to the margins, where they can be ignored without being addressed. Then, as years pass, witnesses age, documents disappear, and memories fade. The official version gains strength simply by surviving. Authority is presumed accurate, and human experience is presumed flawed. Once that presumption is accepted, the system sustains itself. As the modern era approached, and as governments began to acknowledge the existence of unidentified aerial phenomena, as they call them, the Roswell template remained intact. Officials could admit uncertainty without admitting error, and release reports without real answers. Once that pattern is established, it becomes remarkably difficult to undo. As we move forward into the present day, we see this same structure. The language may change and the reports might be dressed in modern terms, but the underlying logic remains consistent. Roswell was not just a UFO incident, it was a policy rehearsal, and the performance has been repeating ever since. Before we jump into File 9, remember that we are conducting a follower drive. It's simple, totally free for you to help, and it takes seconds. Just find our main page wherever you're listening and tap follow. Do that as a favor for me and help Renegade Files hit 100,000 followers. If you're already a follower, you can still help us by sending your friends to therenegadefiles.com and suggesting that they follow us on their favorite platform, because following Renegade Files is free, easy, and keeps them connected to new episodes. Thank you so much. File 9. Echoes at the Pentagon. In June of 2021, more than 7 decades after the events in Roswell, the United States government released a document with a title that sounded deliberately neutral: Preliminary Assessment: Unidentified Aerial Phenomena. This has become known as the Pentagon UFO Report. For many members of the public, this report promised to represent a turning point. After years of denial, dismissal, and silence, the Pentagon was finally going to acknowledge that unknown objects were being encountered by military personnel. The tone of the coverage suggested something historic. Headlines hinted at disclosure, social media buzzed with speculation, and commentators framed the report as the beginning of a new era of transparency. The report was somehow wedged into the first COVID relief bill, the $2.3 trillion appropriations bill, known as the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2021, which was itself a part of the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Securities Act, was signed into law on December 27, 2020. Within this behemoth spending package was money, we don't know exactly how much, but multi-millions of dollars for the Pentagon to create this UFO report. But when the document itself was examined, it became clear that very little had changed. The report was brief, sparse, and carefully worded. It is 9 pages long, and 1 page is the cover, and 2 pages are the appendix, so the document is a mere 6 pages of information and less than 3,000 words. This episode is about 8,000 words. The Pentagon UFO report contained no photographs, no detailed data, and no meaningful conclusions. Its language was cautious, it didn't provide answers, and it just cataloged uncertainty in a way that avoided accountability. The brevity of the report was striking. After decades of sightings, encounters, and military concern, the official public assessment amounted to only a handful of pages. The vast majority of its content consisted of general statements about data limitations, reporting inconsistencies, and the need for further study and the need for more money. For a document that had been anticipated for months and that was said to represent years of analysis, the lack of substance was difficult to ignore. So why did they put the UFO report into the COVID relief spending package? Because by placing the requirement inside emergency legislation, the report avoided public debate. There were no hearings focused on its scope, no sustained discussion about its intent, and no clear mandate for depth. The report existed because it had to, not because there was institutional enthusiasm for UFO disclosure. When the document was finally released, it reflected this reality. The report acknowledged 144 military encounters with unidentified aerial phenomena. That's the new politically correct way to say UFO. Of those, only 1 was explained. The rest were left unresolved, attributed vaguely to airborne clutter, sensor limitations, or unknown factors. And of course, our old favorite, the weather balloon. The language avoided speculation, but it also avoided investigation. Most notably, the report made no mention whatsoever of the Roswell incident, and this was not accidental. Roswell remains one of the most famous and consequential UFO incidents in American history. It is the event that established the original template for military response, media management, and public dismissal. Any serious historic assessment of unidentified aerial phenomena, as they now call them, would at least acknowledge Roswell's existence. By excluding Roswell entirely, the Pentagon UFO report effectively severed modern encounters from their historical context. The UFO phenomenon was reframed as a recent issue, a result of improved sensors and contemporary military operations, rather than part of some long-running pattern. By isolating modern cases from past incidents, the report avoided reopening old questions about how earlier events had been handled and what really happened there. It allowed the government to acknowledge uncertainty about what we're seeing without revisiting past reversals or substitutions, and in doing so, it echoed the same logic first deployed in 1947, where explanations don't need to be proven conclusively, they just need to sound reasonable enough to discourage further inquiry. Public reaction followed predictable lines. Some people thought that the report was great because now they're talking about it. Others just thought it was more nonsense, more bureaucratic double-speak. There was no discussion of recovery programs, no acknowledgement of historical secrecy, no examination of how similar incidents might be managed. The so-called report existed in a vacuum, and this is the modern form of narrative containment. It's bookended. It has a beginning and an end, and the end is final. The difference between 1947 and 2021 is the brevity of that denial. In Roswell, the reversal took a press conference, photos, and captions. In the modern era, it only took 6 pages talking in circles. In both cases, the same old questions go unanswered. This context is essential for understanding the role of individuals and programs that emerged in the years leading up to the report. One of the most significant was ATIP, the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, which came to the public knowledge mostly through Luis Elizondo, who released the early videos, the Tic Tac, the Go Fast, and the, what's the other one? Gimbal, those videos. For listeners interested in a deeper examination of these modern UFO developments, check out Renegade Files episode 45, Breaking UFO News. It becomes essential. Go back and listen to that one, or if you have already, share it with that one friend you know who would like it. That's Renegade Files episode 45, Breaking UFO News. That episode explores the origins of ATIP, the role of Luis Elizondo, and the early stages of these contemporary disclosure conversations. It places the joke of the Pentagon UFO report into a broader context. So when viewed through that lens, the Pentagon's echo of the Roswell playbook becomes unmistakable. Roswell was the opening chapter, and the Pentagon UFO report is now just a footnote written in the same book. And as long as this playbook remains in use, disclosure will continue to arrive in carefully managed fragments, framed not to inform, but to contain. What echoes from the desert in 1947 into the corridors of the Pentagon today is not a single incident, but a method. And that method is still very much alive. My summary. In the summer of 1947, for a brief and electric moment, it felt like the world stood at the edge of something new. Newspapers had announced that a flying saucer was recovered. Radios crackled with speculation. Across the country, people looked up at the sky with a sense of wonder. Were the Martians friendly, fearsome, or, like us, a mixture of both? After years of war, secrecy, and unimaginable destruction, the idea that something beyond Earth might have arrived carried a strange kind of hope. It felt like the dawn of a new era. UFOs were being reported across the globe. Pilots, radar operators, and ordinary citizens were seeing things they couldn't explain. When Roswell landed onto the public record, it seemed to confirm what many had already suspected, that humanity was not alone, and that the universe was far larger and far more mysterious than we had been told. For a moment, it appeared that the truth would finally come out into the open, and whatever was moving through our skies could be studied openly and honestly. That moment didn't last. What followed instead wasn't disclosure but absorption. The Roswell story was not confronted head on, but redirected, reframed, and quietly folded into a bureaucracy designed to neutralize and maintain. The reversal came quickly, the evidence was buried, the witnesses were marginalized, and the story was labeled as explained. Once that label was applied, everything changed. Inquiry became suspicion. Curiosity became embarrassment. Memories became unreliable. And over time, the extraordinary was recorded as a mistake, and the people who had seen something unfamiliar were encouraged, sometimes not so subtly, to stop talking. Roswell did more than introduce the world to UFOs. It introduced the world to a process. A method by which unsettling events could be acknowledged briefly, explained quickly, and then removed from serious consideration. That method was, and is, one of simple repetition, asserted authority, and time. As decades passed, the machinery refined itself. By the time we reached the modern era, the playbook was familiar. Reports could be released without answers. Acknowledgments could be made without accountability. The Pentagon UFO report followed the same structure first deployed in 1947, even though the language evolved. The past was excluded, legacy explanations were recycled. The UFO phenomenon was then reframed as a recent and technical issue rather than historical and unresolved. The myth-making machine has never shut down. Denial, as Roswell teaches us, is not a single decision. It's a process. It unfolds gradually through normalization and deflection until unanswered questions feel too old or too uncomfortable to re-ask. Over time, the official version gains strength simply by surviving, while human experience is treated as flawed. And yet, something persists. The witnesses persisted, the questions persisted. The sense that something important has been lost never fully went away. Roswell remains unresolved, not because it lacks evidence, but because it was never fully brought to light. This is the deeper lesson of the Roswell incident. It's not just a story about a crash in the desert, but about power, memory, manipulation, and truth. Roswell is a story about who gets to decide when a question is finished being asked. It's a story about how easily wonder can be replaced with compliance. In 1947, many believed the flying saucer headline meant that we were about to learn everything. We did learn something. We learned how quickly an important revelation can be absorbed into a system designed to survive it. But in our modern world, the night skies are still busy. Unexplained reports continue, and the playbook of disinformation endures. So, where does Renegade Files go next? Tune in next Wednesday to find out, as together, you and I continue to follow the stories where history, secrecy, and the unexplained all collide. Tap follow right now so we can meet here then. Tap follow right now so we can meet here then. If you liked this episode and the hundreds more I've made and given to you for free, then you can help me keep this independent show alive by joining the RFA agency on Patreon. You get a lot of stuff, it hardly costs a thing, you can try it totally free for a week, and that tiny amount helps me a lot because it blends with the tiny amounts of a lot of people to make a big difference, and it allows me to make these shows for you. I am so glad to have you in the Renegade Files crew. I'm your host, Lex Gordon. Stay Stay wild, mythic child.